We're now live.
Great. Sounds like a TV show. We're not live. Okay, good. Let me then get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where from you're joining us. I'm Rebecca Thyssen. I work at Can International, and I'll be happily moderating this webinar today. A webinar looking at how could we break the cycle between finance, debt, and fossil fuels ahead of the now very famous Santa Marta Conference. So I'll just gonna give you a very short introduction, present the flow of the webinar, and then we'll get going. So just for your information, this webinar is live streamed on YouTube on Can International channel and is also recorded, and you're gonna have access to all the materials that would be shared later on after we finish the webinar. So one first thing we wanted to put as a context is obviously Santa Marta is not happening in a vacuum. We are in a context where we see an illegal war taking place in Iran and Lebanon, perpetrated by the US and Israel, and we also have still an ongoing genocide happening in Palestine. In the context of this crisis, we also see a very clear common threat, which is fossil fuel being at the heart of an imperialist project. And when we say fossil fuels, it obviously goes beyond the fuel itself and its emission. It's actually connected to every aspect of our daily life. Think about food and fertilizer, think about plastics, etc., etc. So we are actually talking about a fossil fuel economy that is distorted against the poor and favorizing the most powerful. So Santa Marta is happening in that context, and it's really important for us not to turn a blind eye, or appear tone deaf to this reality. So it has to be seen, obviously, as an opportunity to finally speak about what a real equitable and funded fossil fuel phase out should be. But it's also important that we connect this conversation to a more systemic one that's looking at all the aspects of the reality we are confronted with, including the finance and economic systems that we are living with. So after setting the scene on what the Santa Marta Conference will be about, and that will be done by Sophie Richmond from Big Shift Global, this webinar will aim to try to shed the light on what are the critical barriers that exist to a fair and equitable phase out. And there we would zoom in specifically on the particular role of international financial institutions and their methods, as well as the role of sovereign debt, because those two aspects are, I think, one of the most burning of the conversation around fossil fuel phase out. And so we will, of course, look at the barriers, but also at the solution and the opportunities that we have in front of us, starting in Santa Marta, but obviously not ending in Santa Marta. And so what has to be done in the coming months and years to tackle and address those systemic barriers. So the program for this morning, afternoon, or evening is first an introduction. So I'll be speaking with Sophie to understand a bit better what is at stake, what is Santa Marta about, and what we can expect from it. And then we will look at one first important barriers to a fair fossil fuel phase-out, looking at IFIs and their policies with Federico Sibaja, who is lead for a fair international financial system at Recourse, and Sherzadi Mood, who is research associate at the Alternative Law Collective based in Pakistan. And then finally, we would look at another important barriers to the fossil fuel phase-out, which is debt and the connection with fossil fuel entrapment. So what is the problem? What it look like in practice, with clear example from the ground, and what are the solutions, going from debt cancellation to systemic reform through a UN debt convention. So that's the menu for today. I hope you have a comfortable seat, you have coffee and water with you, and then we can slowly proceed with the conversation. So Sophie, I will start with you, and thank you for joining so early. We know you are in DC currently following the spring meeting, so it's quite early, so thank you for being here. And so maybe just for everybody to be on the same page and know a bit what we are talking about today, can you explain us briefly what is Santa Marta and what it is about?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for inviting me to join. So Santa Marta is a port city in Colombia, which is going to host this first international conference on the transition away from fossil fuels. The conference is being hosted by Colombia and the Netherlands. Obviously, as you mentioned, we know that fossil fuels are the root cause of the climate crisis. We've seen the delaying tactics by the oil and gas industry, and we know that a transition must happen now. And as civil society, we know that this transition must be fair and financed, and it's important that the transition supports workers and communities and doesn't replicate the colonial extractivist approach that's been in place to date. Um, the conference came out of momentum created during COP30 last year by a coalition of countries wanting to raise ambition for transitioning away from fossil fuels. The UNFCCC processes are important in the fight against the climate crisis, but their consensus-based approach means that there are also limits to the outcomes in this space. And so these are countries that have chosen to be in Santa Marta. I think there's at least 45 countries that have confirmed they'll attend. And this is considered a moment to break the deadlock around the transition away from fossil fuels, and create more buy-in for this process and hopefully centre equity and justice in this. The conference is organised around three pillars: reducing economic dependence on fossil fuels, transforming fossil supply and demand, and strengthening international cooperation and climate diplomacy, which goes back a bit to what you said, Rebecca, about how it's a bigger system. It's not just about the kind of fuels. And lastly, it's not just governments that are meeting in Santa Marta. Civil society groups and academics are organising their own convenings. And I think there's going to be related actions around the world as well. Can maybe share the link to the civil society website as well in a second.
Thanks. That's really useful. And yeah, indeed, there are like, oh, as always in those big convening, you have like the formal and political track with ministers talking to one another, but also a very vibrant civil society space with academics, CSOs, etc. And so yeah, it's useful to have an eye on both. But maybe a reflection from you also, because you're joining us from the spring meetings in DC. How do you see a potential connection between what would come out of Santa Marta and with other processes and other conversations that are meant to happen this year, specifically on the fossil fuel question?
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, I think we have to start with current geopolitics and the war on Iran, as you mentioned in your introduction. This has obviously ignited further the debate on transitioning away from fossil fuels, and or certainly a debate around energy and the related energy crisis. And it's also exposed the kind of fossil fueled system that we live in and the impacts on energy access, on security, on food production, as you mentioned. Um, and this shift away from fossil fuels is imperative, not just because of the climate crisis, but also because of the need for economic stability and energy sovereignty and basically survival for global South countries. I think in terms of linking to other processes, uh, colleagues in this call will talk about debt. But last year there was the FFD4, the Financing for Development Conference. Um, the outcome didn't go as far as civil society had hoped, but did open up some opportunities to continue to push for follow up on debt, on debt cancellation and campaigning for a UN debt convention. I know that May and others will talk about some of those links with fossil fuels. There's also COP30 last year, which I mentioned before, but many saw this as an opportunity to renew calls for an end to fossil fuels. But unfortunately, that wasn't landed. But what was landed at COP in Belém was agreement on just transition. And this was welcomed as one of the strongest rights-based outcomes in the history of the UN climate negotiations. So it was notable for that. And also implicit in that is a pathway for countries to transition away from fossil fuels in a just, equitable, and orderly manner. But COP overall lacked that kind of political space for fossil fuels. So Santa Marta can hopefully take this a step further. Um, and then obviously, as you mentioned, I'm speaking along with Federico from the World Bank IMF Spring meeting. And I think these have really put a spotlight, or these have been put in the spotlight more by the events in Iran. And other colleagues that I'm here with have mentioned how this is a real challenge for the legitimacy of the IMF and the World Bank. Can this multilateral system still actually deliver for countries in the current context? And I think speaking specifically about the transition away from fossil fuels, there's many groups that have fought for years to get finance out of fossil fuels at the World Bank and the IMF. But at the moment, in the current geopolitical context, there's an even bigger risk than ever of backsliding on climate commitments. And so it's also kind of a contrast to those that are in Santa Marta, hopefully trying to deliver this. And hopefully it'll be Santa Marta that wins out and has an influence on here rather than the other way round. And I know that there are also obviously multiple concerns around the MDB model and their role in just transition, the role of the private sector, role of conditionalities, their role in debt as well. And I think that will be unpacked by Federico and others in this webinar as we go.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, thanks. I think it's really important to have those different connection lay out clearly, because it would be probably a strategic mistake for us as civil society to believe that Santa Marta alone can achieve much. Is by conjuncting the different messages through different processes that we actually really can convey a more ambitious vision and more equitable vision of what a phase out should be about. And thank you also for highlighting, I think, sometimes overlooked win that we got. It's not often that we win in the COP space, so I think it's important to remember that we got a really good improvement in terms of the just transition decision, and that has to be directly connected to the phase out discussion as well. So thank you. Maybe a final quick question in a short answer, a very complex one, of course, but what do you expect from Santa Marta? What would be one thing that you think we could get out of this conference?
I mean, obviously, the fact that countries are going there because they've decided to gives a bit of hope in this process. I think the main outcome, obviously, that civil society will be pushing for is that any agreement around a transition away from fossil fuels recognises the importance of doing this in a just and equitable manner.
Yeah, thanks. Perfect answer. I think, yeah, the kind of equity and justice component is probably something that has been missing for too long in the debate. So Santa Marta can be also a good platform to highlight those dimensions. So yes, thank you so much. So now moving on to the second part of the discussion. So trying to dive a bit deeper into one of the probably major obstacle to a fair and equitable phase out is the question of the international financial institution, their policies, their methods, and how that is connected to a fossil fuel phase out on the grounds for countries, and how it's impeding a just transition overall. So I have the pleasure to have two experts with us today to discuss this. So Federico, maybe I'll start with you to set the scene a bit and help our audience to understand a bit better how do IFIs actually impact negatively, positively, you will tell us, a just transition away from fossil fuels, and thinking a bit more concretely about Santa Marta and the three pillars of the conference. Sophie was highlighting, how do you see the connection there and what links could be made? And welcome.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Rebecca, and thank you everyone for being here. I mean, I think maybe for those of you that come from global south countries, there has to be no explanation why is it that international financial institutions are relevant, given the impact that they still continue to have. I mean, the policies that they've taken in the 80s and 90s on structural adjustment and reducing state capacity to lead economic transformation. But these institutions, in the context of the current debt crisis that countries are facing since COVID, they're now back. And actually, the response from the international community to the debt crisis is to increase the financing these institutions have. And actually, we saw last year also in the NCQG, 2 years ago, in the NCQG decision, what's the role that multilateral development banks have there. And in the case of International Monetary Fund, in the context of a weak debt architecture that does not provide the debt restructuring that is needed when countries are under distress. Countries go to the IMF, and the institution, while it continues to claim that it has changed, the reality it hasn't. Some research we did back in 2024 showed how is it that in average IMF programs ask for 3.2% of GDP of fiscal consolidation of austerity, and this is even worse for lower income countries. And right now, discussions we'll discuss it later, but on a debt workout mechanism are also absolutely blocked. And I think it's also worth saying that the majority of these institutions, even though right now there's some other emerging, they are controlled by global north countries, given that the voting system that was arranged for them comes from the post-war period. And then I think something that it's quite important to convey is that some governments that will be going to Santa Marta may seem quite ambitious on fossil fuel phase-outs, but the reality is that what they're doing, what the capitals say that should be done, and the message that they take to the IFI, to the International Financial Institutions boards in Washington or in other capitals, is quite at odds with what we need for the economic transformation that is needed in order to ensure just an equitable fossil fuel phase-out. I think especially on the economic dependency side, also something that we've been hearing now this week in DC related to instability and volatility. Of course, we're now seeing the consequences of fossil fuel price volatility and the consequences of energy systems just relying on the markets. Prices go up, prices go down. Energy is a commodity, and at the end of the day, the investments that we're seeing flowing to global south countries in many cases are actually short-term investments that just try to make the most out of short-term opportunities rather than into productive investments, productive infrastructure. And that is what we need if we are properly discussing green industrial policy, economic transformation, in order to ensure that everyone, that we have well-being all at the same time, the economic transformation that we need. And I think there's something that is important. It's important to have this into account when we discuss with global south governments, because they may also be constrained in what is it that they can say given the debt situation they are in. These governments in many cases are punished by credit rating agencies whenever they speak up in these international conferences. So I think that's where the role of civil society in being more ambitious and knowing that sometimes they will have those limitations and we have a role to play in how to raise the bar. I think it's quite important, while at the same time, as I was saying, like right now, there's a few governments that control how is it that decide what's the shape of the international financial architecture. And I don't think these systemic levers can be changed in the ultra short term, but I think having the opportunity in these multilateral processes of flagging what are the systemic levers and how is it that we can find processes in order to eventually remove them, it's quite important.
No, thanks. I think that's super important indeed, not only to highlight sometime maybe the paradoxal position some countries, specifically global north country, can have by claiming they're very ambitious in certain arenas, for example, in Santa Marta, but then looking at what they're actually pursuing as policies in the context of their domination of the IFIs. I think it's really important that we have those two realities in mind. But as well, thinking about the structure of the conference, the question of international cooperation and the broader economic governance system that we are in, making sure that people are aware of by who it is dominated and for who it is benefiting, and the question of how IFIs are governed, the role of credit rating agencies, and all those implications on the phase-out are also really important, because speaking on the phase-out just in a narrow term would never work in concrete terms and for countries. So thanks for making those connections. So connecting to this, of course, Sherzadi, I maybe turn over to you. There is also, and it has actually been also taking quite an important stage in the context of Santa Marta, the question of fossil fuel subsidies. That has been, pushed as a potential solution and something that countries need to be looking at more. But I found that often when we refer to fossil fuel subsidies, the kind of, again, equity and justice framing is lacking, and it's kind of a more quick fix, short-term measure rather than understanding the whole systems behind it and how it could actually impact the most vulnerable. So I know you've been working on this extensively. So what is your take on what could Santa Marta do about it, and what are the kind of mistakes we should avoid regarding fossil fuel phase out to make sure it's fair and just?
Firstly, thank you for having me. Thank you for everyone who's present. I think, yeah, you're very correct on the framing side of it. And that really connects to what Federico was also saying, is how much of this is being driven by the international financial institutions themselves. And when we look at a conference like COP, we do really see that everything is being framed and driven through this like financial mechanisms. And that really is a reflection of who ends up driving these narratives and who is leading the conversation. And you see institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and the Asian Development Bank really at the forefront of driving this narrative, especially from the global south. And when it comes to human rights, when it comes to energy affordability, those are always sort of like secondary or tertiary. We don't, be in the IMF documents or the World Bank documents, the financial aspect is really the first one, and then you look at everything else. So in sort of more global south context, and specifically in Pakistan, there is a distinct focus on removing subsidies on the consumption end, so inevitably making these much more expensive. So removing them from petroleum, removing universal subsidies in electricity tariffs, and trying to make sure that public utility companies are financially viable instead of providing affordable, cheap energy to people and industry. So, what this also does is it really allows the IFIs to reframe decades long initiatives which have focused on increasing electricity tariffs and removing subsidies, privatization, all of these, which are very much under the fiscal consolidation paradigm, which leads to debt servicing and revenue generation, and they've reframed it as climate measures. So, in the case of Pakistan, which is a part of the Resilience and Sustainability Trust program from the IMF, they're able to present the same exact reforms, but under this sort of more climate green language. But it's really the same exact thing. And what we see is an ignorance to common but differentiated responsibilities as well, because in Pakistan's most recent EFF, it's framing the country as historically a large emitter. And that's largely because they're focusing on a very specific statistic, which is emissions intensity, instead of historic emissions. So even compared to India or China, they're framing Pakistan as a very high emissions based country. And that is why there is a need for these, consolidation measures. Um, I think the interesting part in all of this is that their argument can sound quite intuitive. And I remember like back when I was an undergrad, I sort of bought into their argument quite a lot as well, because they do talk about, the need for efficiency, the need for reducing wasteful spending. And the connection they make with with the climate narrative and connecting it to subsidy is that this really allows for more wasteful spending, especially from richer households. And then there's a broader push towards targeted transfers. And really, what that is sort of a misunderstanding of how these things work, especially in a country like Pakistan. So, the move that is being pushed by the IMF and the World Bank is that one of our small targeted mechanisms called the Benazir Income Support Program will replace the universal broader tariff the tariff subsidy that we provide for electricity. Now, this is, we're okay with that initiative, providing people poverty alleviation incentives is great, but this can only at best provide coverage to about a third of the population in Pakistan that lives under poverty. And then that also ignores the amount of people who are in your sort of lower income, lower middle income class who are really surviving, not necessarily living. And something to keep in mind is that energy prices aren't just, one small thing. They permeate across the entire economy. So higher energy costs, higher electricity costs means a higher, transportation costs, higher food prices, higher healthcare costs. All of these sort of compound for people. So when you come to the global south, uh, which is already living under extreme austerity measures with higher indirect taxes every year due to these fiscal consolidation efforts. When you have these consumer and subsidies removed, and then you also place like carbon taxes, levies, all of that, and on top, justifying it by saying this is going to reduce the demand and make people switch to EVs. You're really sort of like presenting it within this very isolated uh,
Mhm.
situation, right? And it's assuming that history started yesterday and ignores the larger paradigm that they've sort of locked us into. And in Pakistan specifically, we recently in the previous IMF program increased taxes on solar panels, and at the same time we've got these removal of subsidies. So if you're a
Mhm.
lower income household or a lower middle income household, you don't really have an exit strategy. And oil companies in Pakistan, meanwhile, have like a profit margin built in to their oil pricing. So when we are paying for petrol, we are actually paying their profit within that while taking on the higher prices. Uh, Finally, I just want to point out, just connecting to the debt part of it and the narrative from the IFIs. Uh, Something that Federico mentioned was their initiatives in the 60s, in the 70s, and the 80s, which led to more privatization, more independent power producers. In the case of Pakistan, this is actually like playing out as one of its worst case scenarios. We currently, and this is just like me looking at last year's figures, we spend around 3 trillion Pakistani rupees on capacity payments to energy producers, electricity producers. And the IMF allows us around 800 billion in energy subsidies. So there is like a huge 2.2 trillion rupee difference. That's in the billions for
Mhm.
more international viewers would view this in dollars. So it really like is reframing that, right? Capacity payments are effectively an implicit subsidy being provided to them, but it's not framed as that. And I would argue that we should really frame it as an ineffective and inefficient, wasteful subsidy being provided to effectively, you don't really have to produce electricity. You just kind of have to get this payment to receive it. But within the MDB model and within international financial models, this is seen as the best possible case. So I think
Mhm.
there's really a lot of room to criticize that.
Mhm.
And what we know is that this all leads to that sort of, privatization as your final destination. The reason
Mhm.
for electricity tariff increase and removal of subsidies, the implementation of these levies, and also showing public utility companies as inefficient and wasteful is to eventually privatize them and make sure financially they're viewed as something that private investors want to get into. Higher tariffs mean that you'd be able to recover most of your costs and make a good profit on top of it. And recently in Pakistan, we privatized our national airline. And the privatization process worked in a way that the government assumed all the debt and the liabilities of the company. And it also said 90% of the privatization revenue goes back into the company. So we're very sure that that's the model that's going to be applied to these public utility companies and electricity companies, where it's really that socialism for the rich and austerity for the many kind of narrative, where
Mhm.
that money is going to channel into more consolidation and more suffering effectively for
Mhm.
regular people.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. That's a really useful articulation of the different elements of the complex conversation around subsidies, but also how it's often or like majority misperceived, at least from a like global north discourse, IFI-led discourse, and this also kind of private sector first approaches that we see across the board that are just imposed on countries and not at all reflecting their realities and needs. Just maybe back to you both. Federico, I know you were joining us directly from DC, as Sophie and others. So reflecting on the momentum you have now and the different ongoing discussion and policy revision that are on the table, etc. What do you think should happen, of course, this week and in the coming months, to address a bit that kind of distortion between the narrative that's sold by IFIs and the reality on the ground?
maybe I can jump in.
You can start and then show
Okay,
me.
perfect. No, yes, I mean, I think it's going back to this question on the governance structure and how is that these institutions work. Right now, here in the US has both veto power in the IMF and in the World Bank with their horrible agenda and how is that they are blocking any kind of progress or at least see any kind of changes. It's extremely hard to think how these institutions that are already doing lots of harm in the next few years will actually reduce the harm that they're doing. And also, I mean, I think it's important to think what's the other piece, because if I relate this to the debt crisis, it's because international financial institutions provide finance at better terms than the international markets, and that's why global south governments go to them. It's not because global south governments love international financial institutions, but actually they're somehow held hostage by them. And I mean, in these changes in the trends that we've seen on why is it that MDB financing is increasing, is because creditors can more easily control how that finance is being delivered, can attach conditionalities to them, and can shape the developments, like a kind of development for global south countries that it's comfortable for them because it doesn't really challenge these economic dependency structures, the international financial architecture and extraction that at the end of the day goes from the south to the north. And I think that's why it's more important than ever for multilateral processes that are much more democratic to exert pressure on these IFIs that are undemocratic. I mean, we're even seeing it with trade, that the US is trying to have discussions related to industrial policy and trade in the IMF board instead of the WTO. And so I think that's something that needs to be called out. And again, especially for the European governments, we need to hold them accountable for what they're doing on that front.
Yeah, no, thanks, definitely. And maybe also good to flag to people who are following this webinar that usually those meetings happen in DC, of course, like following the US hegemony and their domination. But this year we have, like every 3 years, the opportunity to move away from the United States because the annual meetings will happen in October in Bangkok. So that's also maybe an opportunity to shed light on those kind of imbalance and the wrong governance that's at play, and bringing more forward global south government voices. Sherzadeh, maybe you have another like final reflection on what should be addressed and what could be done in the coming weeks and months. I know it's of course not gonna be easy, but if you have any reflection on solution that we could be pushing for as civil society.
I think just most importantly, the framing side of it, really, that it should be rights-based more than these financial mechanisms. And that really takes away that power from international financial institutions. Because if you move to a framing that's more equitable and based around human rights, then that also starts touching on these other areas that are, sort of able to get away with, the IFIs are able to get away with presenting them as like decarbonization measures. So carbon markets, carbon offsets, which we know historically are more extractive for the global south and aren't necessarily solutions. They're false solutions that sort of push the crisis further ahead. And then also, I think another important thing is within decarbonization and how they frame it, it allows a lot of things like large hydropower to just go unnoticed, because technically that can be framed as a decarbonization effort, right? And in terms of electricity tariffs, it also ends up being cheaper. But it ignores the history of violence associated with them, especially with institutions like the World Bank, which in the 60s made their name with, ecologically and environmentally destructive projects in Pakistan and displaced thousands of communities from there. So I think once we do reframe it and take back the narrative from to a rights-based perspective, we're able to cover a lot more ground. And I think that's sort of the approach that we should be going with.
Definitely, super important point. Thank you both. That was very enlightening, and I think connecting well with also the next conversation. So we now discussed a bit the role of the IFIs, because we could spend, I think, 2 hours just talking about that. But both Federico and Sherzadeh already highlighted the connection between those international financial institutions and the question of debt and how this is impacting countries' ability to transition away from fossil fuels in a way that's equitable, fair, and also respecting their right to sustainable development, right? Their right to development. So Abiba and May, you're both experts on the question of debt and its interlinkages with the climate agenda. So maybe Abiba, I'll start with you. I know you've conducted a bunch of studies and research on the connection between debt and fossil fuels on the ground. So maybe you could talk us through your latest paper and tell us a bit how does those kind of this vicious circle or this debt entrapment works in practice on the ground, and what did you learn from your research?
Thanks so much, Rebecca, for first inviting me and for this very interesting discussion. Yeah, so most recently, there's today a launch of a report on this fossil fuel debt trap, um, which was launched by the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and it's a collective work between MINAFEM, Oil Change International, and independent researchers. And my colleague and MENA Fem Research Fellow Ibrahim Al Hatimi and I contributed to it with a chapter on Egypt, which is what I'll be zooming in today, like looking at the cycle specifically in the context of Egypt, which is one of the most indebted countries currently, especially to the IMF. And so to answer your question, I'll explain like five main consequences of this growing cycle. And already Federico and Shehzadeh already laid out some of these consequences, but I'll kind of put it into context of how that looks like in Egypt. And so the first consequence of having this large percentage of the annual government budget going to pay off debt and interest, instead of spending it on a just green transition, as we said, is that there's a lot of weakening of national industries that happens, which is the core of any kind of like thriving economy. And in Egypt, 60% of this government spending is allocated to debt service. So there's no fiscal space to invest in things like grid infrastructure, providing subsidies for local renewable energy companies, or national green industries like solar panel manufacturing or renewable stations. But instead, again, there's this constant privatization of these very like long-standing national industries and selling shares of them, which is a direct condition of the forced structural adjustment programs by the IMF. And this is a major like lost opportunity to give this like real strength to the economy. And where stable and like skilled employment opportunities uh, currently in Egypt are very scarce. So this kind of green industrial revolution would help a revival if we weren't in this debt trap that rechannels resources into principal payments and interests. And this another consequences of the fossil fuels being like increasingly treated not only as an energy source, but also a way to stabilize the economy or reassure creditors that there's good foreign currency reserves, is that Egypt is forced into a lot of like uneconomic and unnecessary projects, which the population will continue to pay off for decades. Um, and this has like a lot of environmental and human costs. For example, the more kind of evident example is the German energy company Siemens built three massive gas-fired power plants in Egypt in 2015, costing $8 billion, which was Siemens' largest gas plant in history. But the capacity exceeded the needed national demand in Egypt, and there wasn't an existing infrastructure to absorb this. So yeah, Egypt has since tried to sell parts of these assets in kind of desperation to pay off its debts, but it wasn't successful. And this is like a clear example of a carbon lock-in where the country is continuously pushed to rely on gas, but not because it's efficient or profitable, but because the infrastructure and that are already there. And yeah, like Federico already mentioned, this has to be viewed as part of a colonial value extraction and resource extraction, because the projects are primarily for the benefit of European private and government-owned energy companies,
Mm-hmm.
which make the profits at the expense of the local population. And thirdly, there's also, because of this, there's a loss of energy sovereignty, like I already mentioned, but this loss of energy sovereignty also extends to political and even like land sovereignty. For example, even at the peak of the Israeli occupation's genocide, ongoing genocide in Gaza, and despite being major public opposition, um, still Egypt signed a gas deal in the middle of all of this, and despite there being like claims by Israel to take that its imperial plan includes parts of Egypt. So it shows you the extent of this dependency that yeah, you kind of lose a lot of your land sovereignty or your political power. And this can also be seen where Egypt has been forced to also kind of sell some of its land rights to Gulf countries, especially the Emirates, and yeah, kind of giving them total control of acres of land. And these relationships increase fossil fuel investments because you're creating alliances with groups that are not interested in Egypt regaining its energy sovereignty because they benefit from Egypt's economic crisis, and also they want you to import more fossil fuels from them. And last thing I'm gonna mention is that the IMF-led structural adjustment programs impose really harsh austerity measures, like we mentioned, subsidy removal, regressive taxation, and prioritizing investors, which disproportionately impact the most vulnerable people, and they do little to challenge the large-scale polluters. Which increases inequality and poverty to a very large extent. Um, and yeah, and for example, in Egypt is not even meeting its constitutional requirement to spend 6% and 3% of GDP towards education and healthcare, which of course causes a lot of like death and due to an inability for people to access healthcare on a daily basis. So yeah, so what we see is that in Egypt's major economic and social and political crisis, which is intensified due to loans and conditionalities. It's only exacerbated by this death fossil fuel cycle. And the best way out of this cycle is to find a way to regain your energy sovereignty and look for a just transition and putting pressure on global north countries to pay its climate dues. Thank you.
Yes, yes. No, thanks so much. I think it's really useful to have this full cycle explained. Maybe a quick question to you, and then I'll come to May in a second. But knowing also the ongoing illegal war and the impact it has in the region, do you see any direct indirect consequences on this situation coming now, but also in the coming months that you'd like to highlight as well?
Yeah, I can speak in the context of Egypt as that's what I've been following most closely. But yeah, the connection of the war becomes very clear when you understand like how that forces governments into short-term decision making.
Yeah.
For example, because Egypt imports lots of gas from Israel, but that gas field stopped after the war on Iran started, and Egypt was put in a precarious position. And because of the short-term uh, kind of thinking, they put in ineffective measures that impact the population and more than any other groups. So, for example, in Egypt, they imposed like a early shutdown on shops and electricity in the streets starting 9 p.m., claiming that this would save electricity and gas. But in reality, if you look at the statistics, it doesn't. It only reduced it by maybe 1% for electricity and 1% in gas. And but at the same time, these measures have very serious social consequences of people losing their jobs because people like usually shops stay up and open until late. So increased in poverty and also broader social impacts like rising crime or increased harassment because there's no lighting in the street, tightening of public space, And that's not even to go into the impact of the rising prices, which companies and Egypt's government take advantage of and raise prices more than even the real cost of the rise in oil prices. Yeah, so that's just kind of a small example.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think it's really important also to be alive to what's unfolding in the region and beyond because of this war. Thank you so much. May, so over to you. Thank you so much also for being here. So through our speakers now, we've been kind of articulating the links between the current financial architecture, its institution, the role of debt, and the connection with fossil fuels. I know you've been extensively working on this question as well, and you, alongside with the debt justice movement, have been highlighting a series of solutions and specific priorities that we should be pushing for as civil society. One of them being to really overhaul the debt architecture as it currently is, knowing now all its failures and how it's dominated by global north interest. So could you explain us a bit and walk us through the idea of a UN debt convention and what it means for climate justice? Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Rebecca, and delighted to be here in this webinar. Thank you also for previous speakers laying down the context that we have. So as you know, global civil society has been pushing for a UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt. This was blocked at the fourth Financial for Development Conference by rich countries, but we're not giving up. And we're pushing, continuing to push for this, seeing it as a really important step towards not only debt justice, but climate justice as well, and responding to other multiple crises. No, so first, it has the potential to free up funds, public funds for climate action, as well as for renewable energy, because we want the transition to happen quickly in the face of the urgency. And I think the US-Israel war against Iran has highlighted that very starkly, very clearly, that we cannot depend on fossil fuels, and that true energy security really lies on shifting away from fossil fuels. So that's one, that that the debt convention could free up funds for climate justice and debt justice. Second, it's also holds a potential for creating fairer global rules. Currently, we have no space for that. The only space is in creditor-dominated arenas such as the World Banks and the IMF, where Global South has very little voice and very little participation in discussing the issue and in being part of the solutions. So the convention holds the potential as well to correct global inequalities tied to our colonial histories and economic power imbalances. And third, it also has the potential to support countries hit by climate disasters, because included in our proposal is for being able to provide automatic relief for really climate threatened countries. So we've often called for debt relief up to debt cancellation for countries that meet these catastrophic events. And often, countries that are heavily in debt are also the most climate threatened in the world. And we know that the roots of that are in the systemic and structural inequalities of the financial architecture. And fifth, we also want that debt convention to be able to recognize historical responsibility, which only means that, as we've always stressed, that the climate crisis is not of the global South's making, but we are now being hit hardest and worse, being asked to pay for survival through the loans that are being put in just funds. So we've also included that in what we would want their convention to look like. So I'll stop there for now.
Thanks, May. And that's a really useful outline of what a then convention should do and how it's connected to the climate justice agenda. We lost you for a second on your last point, but I believe the whole question around the climate debt and the fact that climate finance cannot be provided through loans, but it has to be grant-based. Yes, that was
Yes.
your point. Yeah, okay, great.
Yes.
Thanks so much. Maybe going back to you two, starting with you, Abiba, and then to you, May. Again, same question I had for the speakers. What do you see as priority or as important messaging that we need to convey as global civil society, looking at Santa Marta specifically, and then in the upcoming months and potentially years? What should we be paying attention to? Is there specific momentum that we should be looking at and more specific demands? So what are your thoughts? Of course, we need to do a lot and everything, but if you would just have to prioritize for the audience today, what would you say? Abiba?
I think what May presented of like looking at the how to pressure to do a UN debt convention, we're all kind of putting a framework on how the impact of debt and how just transition has to include looking at debt and pushing global north countries to actually pay up their climate commitments and also pressuring to cancel debt in any way possible, because that's the core of a lot of the problems that are happening in the global south.
Yeah, definitely. And thanks for adding also the dimension of urgent debt cancellation, because not only we have to reform the debt architecture, but also looking at debt cancellation is like immediate and really needed for a majority of countries. Maybe you want to add also in terms of like the political sequence. What do you have in mind? What type of momentum could we use between Santa Marta, the annuals, next UNGA in 2027?
Yeah. Okay. So first with Santa Marta, we're bringing materials and also share the link to the material on 10 principles for an equitable and just transition. So I hope our participants can check that out, and that will also be distributed in Santa Marta. And secondly, today, in fact, the Borrowers Forum is being launched formally in the sidelines of the spring meetings. So this is another, we look at this not as a separate event, but part of the build-up towards, the big splash that we want to make in October during the annual. So the Borrowers Forum is really an initiative of from that came out, one of the bright spots that came out of Sevilla, and we want to encourage our governments to be part of this, because otherwise it will be like a Chinese cookie without anything inside, no? So Borrowers Forum, where global South countries, borrowing countries, can come together to talk about, to exchange information with each other. I know that this is not a negotiating body, but starting from there, no, sharing each other's problems, also sharing what could be solutions and so forth. So it's a really important event that, of course, it's still unfolding and remains to be seen how it's going to perform. So that also requires us in civil society to monitor, also push for civil society participation along the way. Thanks.
Yeah. Very good flag, very important flag. So indeed, the secretariat would be hosted by UNCTAD, and I believe Egypt and Pakistan are actually going to be the co-chairs. So there is no coincidence here. Thanks. We'll be following those developments closely as well. So because we are in a 60 minutes webinar, sadly, we won't have time for interactive question and answer, but the plan is to note down all the reflection and question we received and to follow up through those in some of the different discussion spaces we have, including the Debt and Climate Working Group. So thanks a lot. I also just wanted to flag Federico made me remember that they have an upcoming very important advocacy piece that's coming up, I think, in a few days ahead of Santa Marta, actually connecting what he explained about the role of IFIs, the connection with just transition, and a fossil fuel phase out. So watch out for that piece as well. Just to wrap us up, I'll invite my colleague Mariana Poli from Oxfam to maybe give us closing remarks. And also, if you're curious to know where you can engage yourself, where you can be active, this is the moment to listen. So Mariana, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rebecca, and good to be here. So this webinar has been organized by the Debt and Climate Working Group, and we have a live WhatsApp that you can join. The group meets monthly, and as we've been discussing here, Santa Marta is one of our biggest priorities, the next ones, but also engaging throughout different moments in the year, Santa Marta, but also Bonn, the annual meeting in Bangkok, as was mentioned here, and then of course COP 31. And it's really important for us to really connect the dots between both and promoting why we need to put the focus on transition away from fossil fuels, including the debt framing, as you heard here today, really pushing for the UN Debt Convention, as May was explaining, and really going on in terms of showing how the debt crisis is accelerating the climate crisis. There are a number of resources that this group puts together. We also work on joint submissions, for example, for the UNFCCC. In Santa Marta, we will have some activities. So if you are coming, if you know people are joining, we have a workshop on the 28th of April. If you're there and want to join, and more information will be shared about this afterwards. We also have the monthly meeting. So it is really a plea for us to connect the dots. We know that a few of the things we're fighting for is more for the long run in terms of system change and on the global architecture reform, on challenging credit rating agencies, the conditionalities, and everything you've heard in this meeting. So it's more for propaganda. Please join us, work with us, and be part of the conversation. And we're going to put the links on the chat that for some reason I can't access now. But yeah, that's what I wanted to flag here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mariana, for this wrap up, and thanks to all the speakers for the great intervention and the connection between the different issues. I hope it was useful. I had a great time. I learned a lot, so it was nice. Thanks also for the participants for the very active discussion in the chat. It's definitely some very important reflections there, so we'll make sure we capture that and continue the conversation. So thank you all. Have a good day. Thanks for those of you who are in DC and it's really early morning, so thanks for that as well. And I'll see you all soon. Bye-bye. Have a good day.